So last week, many of us here at the Abbey watched a 3-part documentary called The U.S. and the Holocaust, which was really well made and very informative, but also quite heartbreaking, full of stories of the horrific experiences of people, especially the Jews, in Germany and around Europe during the Holocaust, Second World War. And it was also quite heartbreaking to learn that many countries, including the United States, were reluctant to accept Jewish refugees. And some countries that were occupied by the Nazis even assisted them in murdering the Jews and deporting them to the death camps. So watching these films, one might get the impression that nobody wanted to help the Jews. No country was willing to help them, but that isn't the case. So a few years ago, I was living in Denmark, and while there I learned about what happened in that country during the Second World War, and it's just really beautiful. So I would like to share that story with you. So Denmark tried to remain neutral during the war. They declared neutrality in 1939, but 1 year later, the Nazis came in and took over. The German army was quite small and had just outdated equipment, so they were easily overwhelmed and they surrendered. And at first, Germany declared that Denmark was a protectorate. Supposedly, they were protecting it from France and Britain. And the Danish government was allowed to continue to function. They actually stayed in the country. They didn't run away, and also the king stayed in the country during the war. So the Danish government sort of cooperated with the Nazis because they wanted to protect the people and their democracy. And in 1940, there were about 7,500 Jews living in Denmark. Most of them were descendants of Jews who had lived there since the late 1600s. But there were also some recent refugees who came from Germany and Eastern Europe. And initially, the Danish Jews were not subjected to the same treatment that Jews in other Nazi-occupied countries were. They didn't have to register themselves or their assets. They didn't have to wear a yellow star or give up their homes and their businesses. And this is a large degree because of the attitude of the Danish people towards the Jews. The government, the king, and most of the Danish people were very supportive and didn't want the Nazis to persecute their Jewish neighbors and friends. And it seems that most of the Danes were opposed to the Nazi occupation, and there was a strong and well-developed resistance movement that carried out acts of sabotage. So over the years, things got more tense between the Germans and the Danes. And in 1943, the Nazis made certain demands that the Danish parliament refused to accept, such as having a death penalty for saboteurs. So at that, the Nazis were unhappy. They dissolved the Danish parliament and declared martial law, and they arrested a lot of people, those who were opposed to them, and they even put the king under house arrest. So in September of that year, in 1943, Hitler ordered the deportation of the Danish Jews. And news of that leaked, and the people mobilized like overnight. So Danish authorities, Jewish community leaders, and countless private citizens facilitated a massive operation to get the Jews into hiding or into temporary sanctuaries. So when the German police tried to arrest Jews on the 1st of October, they weren't able to find very many. And the Danish police refused to cooperate with the German police. And there were many people and groups that protested this order. The royal family, churches, and social and economic organizations. And the Danish resistance movement, assisted by many ordinary Danish citizens, organized a rescue operation. over a period of about a month, some 7,200 Jews and 700 of their non-Jewish relatives were taken to Sweden. So Sweden remained neutral throughout the war, and they were willing to accept the Jewish refugees. So Niels Bohr, who's Nobel Prize winning physicist and probably the most famous Danish Jew, played a role in this operation. So he remained in Denmark during the war, and he had actually been involved in a project to help bring Jewish and other anti-Nazi academics out of Germany and Eastern Europe and help them find jobs elsewhere. But then he got the word that the Germans were planning to arrest him and his family. And so the Danish resistance helped him to escape to Sweden. And the day after he arrived in Sweden, this was again in 1943 at the end of September, he met the King of Sweden, Gustav V, and asked him to make public Sweden's willingness to provide asylum to Jewish refugees. So on the 2nd of October 1943, Swedish radio broadcast that Sweden was ready to offer asylum. And the mass rescue of the Jews from Denmark came swiftly afterwards. So the majority of Danish Jews, or Jews living in Denmark, were able to escape to Sweden, where they remained until the end of the war. But the Nazis were still able to arrest 470 Jews, and they were taken to the Theresienstadt ghetto in Czechoslovakia. But the Danish authorities and the Danish Red Cross continued to ask about their well-being, their whereabouts, their living conditions, and so on. So they were kind of putting pressure on the Nazis. And it seems that because of this, the Nazis didn't transport those Jews to the death camp. They remained in this ghetto in Czechoslovakia until the end of the war. And about 50 of them did die, but the majority of them survived and returned to Denmark at the end of the war. So finally, in the end, only about 120 of the original 7,500 Jews, which is less than 2%, died during the Holocaust. Some of them died in this ghetto in Czechoslovakia. Some died during their attempted escape from Denmark. So that means that more than 98% survived. And this is one of the highest Jewish survival rates for any German-occupied country during the Second World War. And it's really amazing. Compared with other countries. For example, Lithuania, which is not far from Denmark, they had a large Jewish population at the beginning of the war, and by the end of the war, less than 5% were still alive. Some of them were even killed by their fellow Lithuanians, just went on a rampage and even killed them with garden tools like spades and hoes, and it was just awful. So, there's many other stories as well of not necessarily governments, but government officials like diplomats and so on, and ordinary people, private people who risk their lives and their livelihood to save Jews and other refugees during the Second World War. And we find the same in all wars and conflicts, like the war in Ukraine right now. There are always people who have the compassion and the courage to do the right thing and help others who are in need. So we can rejoice in their actions and their efforts and have the aspiration that if the need should ever arise, that we can emulate that example and also do the right thing with compassion and courage.